My daughter-in-law Sandra said the garage has a space heater, you'll be fine out there. After I flew 12 hours from Tokyo to surprise my family for Christmas, while my son David just nodded along. But what they didn't know was that the simple black portfolio I quietly placed on their kitchen counter contained documents that would make them realize they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives, one that would cost them the family fortune they thought they were already entitled to inherit. Before I tell you how one portfolio completely destroyed my ungrateful family's Christmas and their entire future, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Also, drop a comment telling me about a time someone treated you like you didn't matter, only to discover they had massively underestimated who they were dealing with. Your stories inspire these videos, and I read every single comment. My name is Margaret Chen-Williams, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 70 years old, and until 3 days ago I was living what my family believed was a quiet, modest retirement in a small apartment in Kyoto, Japan, teaching English to local children, and living on what they assumed was a basic pension from my late husband's government job. If you saw me stepping off that international flight at Denver International Airport on December 22nd, dragging a single worn suitcase and wearing the same Navy travel outfit I'd had for 5 years, you'd probably think I was just another elderly widow stretching her limited retirement savings to visit family for the holidays. You might feel sorry for this gray-haired grandmother who seemed grateful just to afford the plane ticket, carrying a small bag of duty-free chocolates as Christmas gifts, because that's all her modest budget could apparently handle. You'd see me patiently waiting 2.5 hours for my son David to pick me up, sitting quietly in the crowded airport terminal with my modest black handbag clutched in my lap, looking like every other elderly traveler who was excited just to spend the holidays with family who were generous enough to host her. You might even think how thoughtful David was for agreeing to have his, quote, financially struggling mother stay with them during her rare visit from overseas. Quote, you'd watch me graciously accepting whatever sleeping arrangement they offered, enthusiastically helping with holiday meal preparation despite my jet lag, and keeping quiet when family discussions turned to money or future plans because I appeared grateful for their hospitality and didn't want to overstep my welcome. You'd see an elderly woman who seemed to have no options, no significant resources, and no value beyond the household tasks she could perform and the occasional babysitting she could provide for her 2 energetic grandchildren. You'd observe me carefully counting out exact change when David grudgingly took me to the grocery store, politely declining expensive items, and sticking to necessities because I appeared to be living on a fixed income that barely covered basic expenses. You might watch me mending a small tear in my coat rather than buying a new one, or see me gratefully accepting hand-me-down sweaters from Sandra because I seemed unable to afford winter clothes appropriate for Colorado's December weather. You'd notice me taking pictures with an older model smartphone, using coupons Sandra had given me, and expressing genuine amazement at the size and luxury of their suburban Denver home, as if I'd never experienced such comfort before. You might see me washing dishes after every meal, folding laundry without being asked, and keeping my modest belongings neatly contained in the small space they'd allocated for my visit. And that's exactly what my family thought they knew about me. They had no idea that the retired English teacher folding their laundry in the garage had been quietly building and managing one of the most successful international investment portfolios in Asia, while they dismissed her as a burden they were graciously accommodating during the holidays. They saw my modest lifestyle and assumed complete financial dependence. They saw my quiet acceptance of their garage hospitality and assumed I had no other options. They saw my age and my simple living situation in Japan, and assumed I was finished contributing anything meaningful to the world. They couldn't have been more wrong about any of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how David and Sandra's Christmas cruelty became the catalyst for the most devastating lesson in respect they would ever receive, you need to know the whole story. You need to understand who I really am, what I've been building for the past 15 years in Japan, and why the people who should have known me best never bothered to look beyond the surface of the woman they thought they were doing a favor by housing in their garage. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story, 15 years ago, when I first moved to Japan and my family assumed they knew exactly what that decision meant about my financial situation and my future prospects. My story begins in 2009, when my husband Robert Williams passed away from cancer at the age of 68. Robert had been a dedicated civil servant for 35 years, working in various departments of the Colorado state government, and his pension and life insurance provided what most people would consider a comfortable but modest retirement benefit. The death certificate listed his occupation as government administrator, and his obituary mentioned his dedicated service to the state and his love for his family. What the obituary didn't mention, and what my family never bothered to ask about, was that Robert had also been one of the most brilliant financial minds I'd ever encountered, with an almost supernatural ability to analyze international markets and identify investment opportunities that others missed completely. Robert had spent his evenings and weekends studying Asian markets, particularly Japan, Korea, and emerging opportunities in technology sectors that most American investors ignored because they seemed too foreign or complex to understand. While his government colleagues were watching television or playing golf, Robert was analyzing currency fluctuations, studying demographic trends in aging populations, and identifying technology companies that were developing solutions for problems that didn't even exist yet in American markets. But Robert was also a humble man who believed in living modestly regardless of his investment success. We drove reliable used cars, lived in a comfortable but unpretentious home, and saved almost every dollar of his government salary while reinvesting the profits from his international portfolio. Our neighbors and family saw a middle-class government worker and his wife living a simple, frugal lifestyle, never imagining that Robert was actually building wealth that far exceeded what his day job could ever provide. When Robert died, he left me with more than just grief and memories. He left me with detailed investment notes, carefully documented strategies, and a portfolio of international holdings that most financial advisors would have been thrilled to manage. But more importantly, he left me with 15 years of education about global markets and an understanding of opportunities that American investors consistently overlooked. The life insurance payout was exactly what my family expected, enough to cover funeral expenses and provide a modest cushion for my retirement, but nothing that suggested extraordinary wealth. What they didn't know was that Robert's real legacy was a collection of investment accounts, international holdings, and financial instruments that represented decades of careful, sophisticated wealth building. 6 months after Robert's funeral, I made a decision that shocked my family. I announced that I was selling our Colorado home and moving to Japan to teach English as a foreign language. David and Sandra were horrified by what they saw as an impractical, potentially dangerous decision for a 65-year-old widow to make. They couldn't understand why I would want to leave everything familiar behind to move to a country where I didn't speak the language fluently, didn't have established connections, and would be completely dependent on whatever modest income I could earn teaching English to children. "Mom, this is crazy," David said during one of our heated discussions about my plans. "You're 65 years old, you don't speak Japanese well enough to handle daily life, and you'll be completely alone in a foreign country with no support system. What happens if you get sick? What happens if you can't find work? What happens if you run out of money?" Sandra was even more direct in her opposition. "Maggie, I understand that you're grieving and maybe you want a change of scenery, but moving to Japan isn't a reasonable solution. You should stay here, where we can help you, where you have Medicare and Social Security, where you know the culture and the language. Teaching English might sound romantic, but it's not a realistic career plan for someone your age." They presented their concerns as loving worry about my welfare, but I could see the underlying assumptions that drove their opposition. They believed I was making an emotional decision based on grief rather than a practical decision based on opportunity. They assumed I was running away from my problems rather than running toward possibilities they couldn't imagine. Most importantly, they believed I was putting myself in a vulnerable position where I would eventually need their financial support and assistance, and they weren't enthusiastic about taking on that responsibility. But what David and Sandra didn't understand was that my decision to move to Japan wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was strategic. Robert had taught me that the most profitable investments were often the ones that seemed counterintuitive or risky to conventional thinking. Moving to Japan wasn't just about teaching English. It was about positioning myself in the center of Asian markets where I could implement Robert's investment strategies with the kind of cultural knowledge and local presence that American investors could never replicate. When I sold our Colorado home, my family assumed the proceeds would represent the bulk of my available assets, enough to fund a few years of modest living in Japan before I would inevitably return to the United States with depleted savings and a need for family support. They had no idea that the house sale represented less than 5% of my actual net worth, or that my move to Japan was actually a business expansion rather than a retirement adventure. The apartment I rented in Kyoto was small, simple, and inexpensive by American standards, which reinforced my family's assumptions about my limited resources. The English teaching position I accepted at a local community center paid modestly and seemed to confirm their beliefs about my financial situation. My emails home described my daily life, my students, my exploration of Japanese culture, and my gradual improvement in language skills. All activities that painted a picture of a woman living simply and finding fulfillment in meaningful work, rather than material success. What I didn't mention in those emails was that my modest Kyoto apartment was actually a strategic choice that minimized my living expenses while maximizing my investment capital. I didn't describe the sophisticated home office I'd set up with multiple monitors, real-time market data feeds, and communication systems that allowed me to trade in Asian markets during optimal hours while most American investors were sleeping. Quote, I never mentioned the relationships I was building with Japanese financial advisors, Korean technology scouts, and Hong Kong investment managers who provided insights into opportunities that weren't available through American brokerages. I didn't discuss the language classes I was taking not just for daily conversation, but for understanding financial documents, legal contracts, and business negotiations in Japanese and Mandarin. My family saw my Instagram posts of cherry blossoms, visits to temples, and English lessons with enthusiastic students, and they interpreted these images as evidence that I was living a simple, culturally enriching retirement, funded by modest savings and teaching income. They never imagined that the woman posting pictures of her modest apartment and simple meals was actually analyzing demographic trends in aging populations, identifying healthcare technology companies, and building positions in firms that were developing solutions for challenges that Japan was facing today, but that America would face in the next decade. While David and Sandra were living their comfortable but financially strained lives in suburban Denver, David working as a mid-level marketing manager and Sandra handling part-time administrative work while raising their 2 children, I was quietly building wealth at a rate that would have shocked them if they'd had any idea what was actually happening in my Kyoto apartment each morning between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. local time. The English teaching wasn't just a cover story. I genuinely enjoyed working with my students and found real satisfaction in helping Japanese children improve their language skills. But it was also the perfect explanation for why I was living modestly, despite having resources that could have supported a much more luxurious lifestyle. My students and their parents saw a dedicated grandmotherly teacher who had chosen to spend her retirement years contributing to their community rather than enjoying leisure and comfort. My neighbors saw a friendly foreign retiree who was respectful of local customs and lived quietly within her apparent means. My family saw confirmation of their assumptions about my limited resources and practical lifestyle choices. Quote, none of them realized that the modest English teacher was also one of the most successful individual investors in Asian markets, consistently outperforming major hedge funds while maintaining a lifestyle that appeared humble but was actually strategically designed to maximize investment opportunities. The turning point in my family's assumptions about my situation came 2 years ago, when David and Sandra started having serious financial problems. David's marketing company had been struggling for several years as digital advertising shifted toward platforms and strategies that his firm hadn't adapted to quickly enough. Several major clients had terminated their contracts, and David was facing the possibility of significant layoffs or even closing the business entirely. Sandra's part-time work wasn't sufficient to cover their mortgage, car payments, and the children's expenses, and they were rapidly accumulating credit card debt trying to maintain their lifestyle, while David's income became increasingly unreliable. The first sign that they were viewing me as a potential financial resource came during a video call last Christmas, when David casually mentioned that they were considering refinancing their house to access equity for David's business. Mom, the financial advisor said we have enough equity to pull out about $80,000, which would give David's company the capital injection it needs to upgrade technology and pursue some new client opportunities, Sandra explained during our call. But the payments would be higher, and we're trying to decide if it's worth the risk. Have you considered other options for business funding? I asked carefully. Well, we've looked into small business loans, but the interest rates are pretty high, and they want personal guarantees that would put our house at risk anyway. We've thought about bringing in an investor, but that would mean giving up ownership control of the company. David jumped in with what seemed like an afterthought, but which I recognized as a carefully planned suggestion. Mom, we were wondering if you might be interested in investing in the business. I know you probably don't have a lot of liquid assets, but if you had any savings you were looking to invest, we could offer you a really good return and you'd be helping family at the same time. What kind of investment were you thinking about, David? Quote. Well, even if you could invest $10,000 or $15,000, it would help with immediate cash flow, and we could pay you back with interest over the next few years. It would be much better than having that money sitting in some low-interest savings account in Japan. David's assumption that I might have $10,000 or $15,000 in savings to invest showed exactly how completely he misunderstood my financial situation. He was imagining that his English teacher mother might have managed to save a modest nest egg from her teaching income and Robert's pension, and he was presenting the opportunity to help his business as a favor he was doing for me by offering better returns than I could get elsewhere. That's an interesting idea, David. Let me think about it and get back to you. Sure, Mom, no pressure. We're just exploring all our options, and we thought it might be a good opportunity for you to get better returns on your retirement savings while helping family at the same time. The conversation continued with updates about the children, David's business challenges, and my teaching activities, but I could sense that they were now viewing me differently than they had before. I was no longer just the aging mother who had made an impractical decision to move to Japan. I was a potential financial resource who might be able to help solve their problems. Over the next few months, David's references to money became more frequent and more specific. He would mention their mortgage payments, the children's expenses, or business costs during our conversations, always in the context of general life updates, but with an undertone that suggested he was hoping I might offer assistance. Emma needs braces, and the orthodontist says it's going to cost about $6,000 over the next 2 years, Sandra mentioned during one call. Insurance covers some of it, but we're looking at a pretty significant out-of-pocket expense. The kids are both interested in summer camps this year, but the good programs are really expensive, David added during another conversation. We want to give them opportunities, but it's tough when business has been slow. These weren't direct requests for money, but they were clearly testing whether I might volunteer to help with expenses that they were presenting as financial strains on their family budget. Quote, the most telling conversation came 6 months ago, when David called with what he described as, quote, exciting news about a potential business opportunity that required immediate capital investment. Mom, we have a chance to land a major client, but they want us to demonstrate that we have the resources to handle a large-scale campaign. We need to show about $50,000 in available capital to prove we're financially stable enough to manage their account. That sounds like a significant opportunity, David. It really is, Mom. This client could completely turn around our business and set us up for major growth over the next few years. But we need to move quickly, and we need to show them that we have access to capital. David paused for a moment before continuing with what was clearly the real purpose of his call. Mom, I know this is a big ask, and I know you're living on a fixed income, but we were wondering if you might consider lending us some money to help secure this client. We could pay you back within 6 months, and we'd pay you better interest than you're getting on any savings account. How much money are you talking about, David? Well, ideally, we'd need about $40,000 to really demonstrate financial stability. I know that's probably more than you have available, but even if you could help with part of it, we could probably find other sources for the rest. David's request for $40,000 revealed how dramatically he had expanded his assumptions about my financial resources. 6 months earlier, he had been hoping I might invest $10,000 or $15,000. Now he was asking for nearly 3 times that amount and suggesting it was only part of what he ideally needed. But more importantly, his request revealed that he now saw me as a solution to his business problems rather than as a family member deserving of respect and consideration for my own needs and preferences. David, that's a substantial amount of money. Can you send me some information about your business situation and this potential client so I can understand what you're asking me to invest in? Of course, Mom. I'll put together some documents that explain everything. And Mom, I really appreciate you even considering this. I know it's a lot to ask, but we're family, and this could really secure our future. Quote. After that conversation, I realized that David and Sandra's perception of me had shifted from viewing me as a financially limited retiree to seeing me as a potential source of capital for their struggling business. They were no longer just keeping in touch with their aging mother. They were cultivating a relationship with someone they hoped would solve their financial problems. But they still had no idea what they were actually dealing with. The documents David sent me about his business situation confirmed what I had suspected. His company was in serious trouble, his client base was shrinking, and his request for $40,000 was probably just the beginning of what he would need to keep the business afloat. More importantly, his business plan showed no understanding of the digital marketing trends that were reshaping his industry, no strategy for adapting to changes that were already underway, and no realistic assessment of why his major clients had chosen to work with competitors instead of his firm. David was asking me to invest in a failing business that he didn't understand how to fix, and he was presenting this investment opportunity as a favor he was doing for me by offering better returns than I could get elsewhere. But rather than declining his request or explaining my concerns about his business model, I decided to see how far he would go with his assumptions about my resources and his entitlement to my financial support. David, I said during our next call, I've reviewed your business documents and I'd like to discuss this investment opportunity in person. I'm planning to visit for Christmas, and we can talk about everything then. That's great, Mom. We'd love to have you for Christmas, and it'll be perfect timing to finalize everything. The kids are so excited to see you, and Sandra's already planning a big holiday meal. David's enthusiasm about my Christmas visit was clearly connected to his expectations about my investment in his business, rather than genuine excitement about seeing his mother after a year of separation. I'll book my flight and let you know the details. And David, I think you'll be surprised by what I've been able to save during my time in Japan. Really? That's wonderful, Mom. I knew the lower cost of living there would probably help you stretch your retirement savings. Single quote. David's response confirmed that he still fundamentally misunderstood my financial situation. He thought my comment about savings meant that I had been able to live frugally enough in Japan to preserve more of my modest retirement resources than he had expected. He had no idea that I was referring to investment gains that exceeded his business's total revenue for the past 3 years combined. As I booked my flight from Tokyo to Denver and prepared for what would be the most important Christmas visit of my life, I reflected on how completely my family had misjudged both my capabilities and my character. They saw my modest lifestyle and assumed financial limitation. They saw my willingness to live simply and assumed I had no other options. They saw my age and my choice to live abroad and assumed I was becoming irrelevant to their lives except as a potential source of financial assistance. But they were about to discover that their assumptions about their mother had been as wrong as their assumptions about everything else in their lives. The flight from Tokyo to Denver takes 12 hours, and as I sat in my economy seat with my worn carry-on bag and simple travel clothes, I spent those 12 hours thinking about exactly how I would handle the next few days with my family. I had spent 15 years building something extraordinary while appearing to live an ordinary life. I had accumulated wealth, knowledge, and capabilities that my family couldn't imagine, while they treated me as someone whose primary value was her potential willingness to solve their financial problems with whatever modest savings she might have managed to accumulate. The black portfolio I carried in my handbag contained documents that would not only shock them, but would also demonstrate exactly what kind of person they had been treating as a convenient source of emergency funding. But first, I wanted to see just how far they would go with their assumptions about my resources and their entitlement to my support. Because sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that cost the most to learn, and my family was about to receive an education about respect, assumptions, and consequences that they would never forget. As the plane descended toward Denver International Airport on December 22nd, I was ready to begin the most important Christmas lesson I would ever teach my family about exactly who they had been taking for granted. The moment I stepped off that plane at Denver International Airport on December 22nd, dragging my single worn suitcase behind me, I could see exactly how my family perceived me through the eyes of every other traveler in that busy terminal. I was just another elderly woman in sensible shoes and a practical navy coat, moving slowly through the crowds with the careful, measured steps of someone who couldn't afford to fall and break a hip. My appearance had been carefully cultivated over 15 years to project exactly the image my family expected to see. The navy coat was 5 years old but well-maintained, suggesting someone who took care of her belongings because she couldn't afford to replace them frequently. My modest black handbag was large enough to be practical, but small enough to suggest limited shopping habits. Even my choice to check only one suitcase reinforced the perception of someone traveling on a tight budget who had packed carefully to avoid excess baggage fees. The duty-free chocolates in my carry-on bag were another strategic choice. Royce Nama chocolate from Tokyo. Genuinely nice, but the kind of gift that suggested thoughtfulness rather than extravagance. The kind of present that said, I spent my limited discretionary income on something special for my family, rather than I can afford whatever I want. The shopping bag itself was worn enough to suggest I had saved it from a previous purchase rather than buying fresh packaging for gift giving. As I waited in the arrivals area, I observed other travelers being greeted by their families. Enthusiastic hugs, immediate offers to carry luggage, excited questions about the flight and travel experience. Children running to embrace returning grandparents, families gathering for group photos to commemorate holiday reunions, couples excitedly discussing dinner plans and holiday activities. When David finally appeared, 90 minutes after my scheduled arrival time, his greeting confirmed everything I needed to know about how this visit was going to proceed. Hey Mom, sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible, and I had to finish up some work calls before I could leave. His hug was brief and distracted, and his eyes immediately went to my single suitcase as if he were calculating how much space my belongings would take up in his car and his home. No problem, sweetheart. I know you're busy, especially right before Christmas. I smiled genuinely, because David's casual lateness was actually perfect for my purposes. It immediately established that my convenience wasn't a priority, and that my visit was being accommodated rather than celebrated. Is this all your luggage? David asked, lifting my suitcase with a slightly surprised expression. I thought you might bring more stuff for a 2-week visit. I've learned to pack light living in Japan. You don't need much when you're just visiting family. This was technically true, though the real reason for my minimal luggage was that I already owned everything I needed and wasn't planning to stay long enough to require extensive wardrobe options. As we walked toward the parking garage, David's conversation revealed exactly how he viewed my current life situation and what he expected from my visit. So how was the flight? I bet flying economy for 12 hours was pretty rough at your age. I keep telling Sandra we should look into getting you upgrades for these long international trips. But business class is just so expensive, you know. David's comment about flight upgrades was interesting for several reasons. First, it suggested that he saw me as someone who couldn't afford business class tickets but might need family assistance to travel more comfortably. Second, it positioned him as thoughtful and generous for considering such assistance, while simultaneously explaining why he hadn't actually provided it. Third, it established his assumption that I would continue making these international visits and would need ongoing help with travel arrangements. The flight was fine, David. I've gotten used to long travel days, and economy class is perfectly comfortable when you know how to prepare for it. I kept my tone cheerful and uncomplaining, reinforcing the image of someone who had learned to make the best of limited options rather than someone who could easily afford better accommodations. Well, we're really excited to have you for Christmas. Sandra's been planning meals and activities, and the kids have been asking about you constantly. Emma especially wants to show you her school projects and tell you about all the things she's been learning. David's description of family excitement was warm and genuine, which made what happened next even more revealing about their true priorities and expectations. As we reached his car, a 3-year-old Honda CR-V with visible wear and several small dents, David popped the trunk and loaded my suitcase with the efficiency of someone who had already determined exactly where everything would fit in his home and his holiday schedule. Mom, I should probably mention that we're going to need to put you in the garage apartment for this visit. I know it's not ideal, but Emma and Jake have friends staying over during winter break, and Sandra's sister is coming with her family for a few days after Christmas. The house is just really full this year. David's explanation came out in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing this speech during the drive to the airport and wanted to get it over with quickly. His tone suggested that he expected me to be disappointed, but also expected me to understand and accept the arrangement without complaint. The garage apartment? I asked, genuinely curious about what they had prepared for me. Yeah, we converted the space above the garage a couple of years ago. It's actually pretty nice. It has heat, electricity, a small bathroom, and even a mini fridge. Sandra set up a comfortable chair and got some extra blankets, so you should be perfectly warm and cozy out there. David's description of the garage apartment was delivered with the enthusiasm of someone trying to sell a questionable product. The fact that he emphasized basic amenities like heat and electricity suggested that these features weren't necessarily guaranteed in the space, and his mention of extra blankets implied that the heating might not be entirely adequate for December in Colorado. That sounds fine, David. I appreciate you making space for me during such a busy time. My response was gracious and uncomplaining, exactly what David expected from his grateful mother who was being accommodated during the holidays. Great. I knew you'd understand. And honestly, you might actually prefer the privacy. The main house gets pretty chaotic with all the kids around, so the garage apartment will give you a quiet space to relax and recover from your jet lag. David was reframing the garage accommodation as a benefit rather than a slight, suggesting that being separated from the family activities was actually preferable for someone my age who might find holiday chaos overwhelming rather than enjoyable. The 20-minute drive from the airport to David's suburban Denver home continued this pattern of casual assumptions about my limitations, resources, and expectations. So how's the teaching going? Are you still working with the same group of kids? David asked, as we navigated through afternoon traffic. Yes, I have about 15 regular students now, ages 6 to 12. It's really rewarding work, watching them progress with their English skills. That's great, Mom. I'm sure the income helps too, right? Teaching English probably pays pretty well in Japan. David's question about income was phrased casually, but it revealed his ongoing interest in my financial situation. He was fishing for information about my earning capacity and trying to understand how much money I might have available for investment opportunities or family assistance. The pay is modest, but it covers my living expenses and gives me something meaningful to do with my retirement. This was perfectly true, though David had no way of knowing that my living expenses in Japan were deliberately minimal, and that my teaching income represented less than 1% of my actual monthly cash flow. And you're still living in that small apartment in Kyoto. Are you happy with the neighborhood and everything? The apartment is perfect for my needs, and the neighborhood is wonderful. Very quiet, close to everything I need, and the neighbors are friendly and helpful. David's questions about my living situation were clearly designed to confirm his assumptions about my modest lifestyle and limited resources. He wanted to verify that I was still living simply and frugally, which would support his belief that I had managed to save money through careful budgeting rather than through any kind of significant income generation. That's so great that you've adapted so well to living there. I have to admit, when you first told us you were moving to Japan, Sandra and I were really worried that it might be too challenging for someone your age, especially being so far from family. I understand why you were concerned, but it's worked out beautifully. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones that seem risky at first. Absolutely. And I bet the cost of living is so much lower there than it would be here in Colorado. You're probably able to save a lot more money than you could if you were living in the U.S. Quote, there it was. David's assumption that my ability to save money was primarily due to geographic arbitrage rather than income generation. He believed I was stretching my fixed retirement income further by living in a place where expenses were lower, not realizing that I had chosen Japan as a base of operations for investment activities that generated more wealth in a single good month than he earned in an entire year. Japan has definitely allowed me to live comfortably within my means, I replied, which was technically accurate while reinforcing his assumptions about my financial strategy. As we pulled into the driveway of David's house, a nice but not extravagant 2-story suburban home with a well-maintained but modest landscaping, I could see Sandra waiting on the front porch with 12-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Jake. Sandra's greeting was warm and seemed genuinely enthusiastic, though I noticed her eyes immediately went to my single suitcase just as David's had at the airport. Maggie, we're so excited you're here. The kids have been counting down the days until your visit. Sandra's hug was longer and more affectionate than David's had been, and her smile appeared genuine. Grandma Maggie! Emma rushed forward for an enthusiastic embrace, followed closely by Jake, who was slightly more reserved but clearly happy to see me. Look how much you've both grown, I exclaimed, genuinely delighted to see my grandchildren after a year of separation. Emma, you're almost as tall as I am. And Jake, you look so grown up. The children's excitement was the first authentically joyful part of my arrival, and it reminded me why family relationships mattered enough to fight for, even when the adults had lost sight of what those relationships should be based on. Grandma, I have so much to show you. I made the honor roll this semester, and I'm in the school play, and I learned how to make origami cranes. Can you teach me some Japanese words? Emma's enthusiasm was infectious and completely genuine. And I'm on the basketball team now, and I've been learning guitar, and Dad said you might have stories about Japan, Jake added, his initial shyness giving way to excitement about all the things he wanted to share. I can't wait to hear about everything you've been doing and see all your projects. We're going to have such a wonderful time together. Quote, as we moved toward the house, Sandra began what I quickly realized was a carefully prepared explanation of the sleeping arrangements. Maggie, I want to show you where you'll be staying. We've set up the space above the garage for you, and I think you're going to love how private and peaceful it is. Sandra's tone was enthusiastic, as if she were describing a luxury accommodation rather than relegating me to an outbuilding. We've been using it as a guest space for a while now, and everyone who stays there says it's like having their own little apartment. You'll have complete privacy and quiet, which I thought might be perfect for recovering from that long flight. Sandra was using the same reframing strategy that David had employed in the car, presenting the garage apartment as a premium option rather than a secondary accommodation. Her emphasis on privacy and quiet suggested that she thought I would prefer isolation over integration into family activities. As we walked around to the back of the house, I could see the garage apartment for what it really was. A hastily converted storage space that had been fitted with basic amenities to create the minimum acceptable accommodation for unwanted house guests. The apartment was accessed by a narrow wooden staircase attached to the exterior of the garage, leading to a small door that opened into what had clearly been designed as storage space rather than living quarters. The space was perhaps 300 square feet, with low slanted ceilings that followed the roofline, a single small window, and basic furnishings that looked like they had been assembled from various cast-offs and garage sale finds. See, it has everything you need, Sandra said brightly, gesturing around the space. There's a comfortable bed, a little sitting area with that nice armchair, a mini fridge for snacks and drinks, and the bathroom is right through that door. The comfortable bed was a narrow twin mattress on a basic metal frame, covered with what appeared to be mismatched sheets and blankets that had seen better days. The little sitting area consisted of a worn recliner that had probably been rescued from someone's basement, positioned in front of a small television that looked like it was at least 10 years old. The mini fridge was the kind of compact unit typically found in college dorm rooms, and the bathroom was barely large enough to turn around in. And look, we set up this space heater to make sure you stay nice and warm, Sandra continued, pointing to a small electric heater that was clearly intended to be the primary heat source for the space. The thermostat for the main house doesn't control this area, but the space heater works great. The fact that the garage apartment wasn't connected to the main house's heating system explained David's earlier emphasis on heat being available and Sandra's provision of extra blankets. In December in Colorado, a single space heater would struggle to keep the poorly insulated space comfortable, let alone warm. This is very thoughtful, Sandra. I'm sure I'll be perfectly comfortable here. I maintained my gracious, uncomplaining demeanor while mentally noting every detail of how my family had chosen to accommodate their mother, who had flown 12 hours to spend Christmas with them. Great! I put some towels and toiletries in the bathroom, and there are some snacks and bottled water in the mini fridge. Oh, and I should mention that the Wi-Fi doesn't reach out here very well, but you can always come into the main house if you need to use the internet for anything. The Wi-Fi limitation was actually significant, though Sandra presented it as a minor inconvenience. Without reliable internet access, I would be cut off from communication, entertainment, and any online activities during the hours when I was banished to the garage apartment. This isolation was probably intentional, ensuring that my presence wouldn't interfere with family routines or activities. That's fine, Sandra. I'm here to spend time with family, not to be online. Exactly, this will be like a little digital detox for you, very relaxing and peaceful. As Sandra continued her tour of the garage apartment, pointing out features like the single electrical outlet, you can charge your phone right here, and the small window, such nice natural light during the day, I began to understand the full scope of how my family viewed my place in their lives and their home. The garage apartment wasn't just a space limitation issue, it was a statement about hierarchy, importance, and belonging. While Emma and Jake's friends were being accommodated in the main house, while Sandra's sister and her family would presumably be given proper bedrooms, I was being housed in what was essentially a converted storage shed. The message was clear. I was welcome for Christmas, but only in a way that didn't disrupt their normal routines, didn't require them to give up any comfort or convenience, and didn't suggest that my presence was particularly valued or celebrated. "Why don't you get settled in and rest a bit?" Sandra suggested. "We're planning to have dinner around 6, so you have a few hours to recover from your flight. Just come to the back door when you're ready, and we'll all eat together." The suggestion that I get settled and rest reinforced the perception of me as an elderly person who would need recovery time from travel and might become a burden if I didn't pace myself appropriately. The instruction to use the back door rather than the front door was another small but telling detail about my status in the household. That sounds perfect. I am a little tired from the travel, so a few hours to relax will be wonderful. After Sandra left me alone in the garage apartment, I took a few minutes to fully appreciate the irony of my situation. Here I was, a woman with a net worth that exceeded 8 figures, sitting in a converted garage space that most college students would consider substandard housing, being treated like a charity case who should be grateful for whatever accommodation her family was willing to provide. The space heater was already struggling to warm the poorly insulated room, and I could feel cold air seeping in around the small window and under the door. The thin walls allowed me to hear every sound from the main house: children playing, television programs, normal family conversation, while making it clear that I was physically and socially separated from those activities. As I unpacked my modest suitcase, placing my simple clothes in the small dresser that Sandra had provided, I reflected on how perfectly this arrangement served my purposes for this visit. My family had immediately established their perception of me as someone whose comfort was secondary to their convenience, whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated, and whose accommodations could be minimal because I was expected to be grateful for whatever I received. They had no idea that the woman they had housed in their garage was evaluating their character, documenting their treatment of me, and preparing to teach them a lesson about assumptions and consequences that would change their lives forever. The black portfolio in my handbag contained documents that would reveal exactly how wrong their assumptions about my resources had been, but more importantly, it contained evidence of how right my assumptions about their character were proving to be. As I prepared for dinner with my family on my first evening in their garage apartment, I was already looking forward to the moment when they would realize that the grateful, financially limited elderly woman they were reluctantly hosting was actually someone who could have bought their house with pocket change, but who had chosen instead to fly 12 hours to see if they were worth having a relationship with at all. The answer to that question was becoming clearer with every passing hour. That evening's dinner conversation would provide even more evidence of how my family really viewed me, and why the contents of my black portfolio were going to shock them in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Because sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones about respect, and my family was about to enroll in a masterclass they would never forget. After Sandra left me alone in the garage apartment, I spent the next hour carefully observing details that would become important later. The thin walls that allowed me to hear every conversation in the main house also meant that my family could hear very little of what happened in my space, a privacy feature that would prove more valuable than they realized. I unpacked my modest suitcase with deliberate care, placing my simple clothes in the small dresser, while keeping my most important possession, the black portfolio, secure in my handbag. As I arranged my few belongings in the cramped space, I could hear David and Sandra discussing dinner preparations in voices they clearly didn't think I could overhear. "I think she's taking the garage situation pretty well," Sandra was saying. "She didn't complain at all, which is good, because honestly, I was worried she might expect to stay in Emma's room or something." "Mom's always been pretty low maintenance," David replied. "And let's be honest, she's probably used to small spaces after living in that tiny apartment in Japan for so long. This is probably an upgrade for her." Their conversation revealed several important assumptions. First, they believed I was low maintenance because I had limited options, rather than because I chose to be gracious. Second, they assumed my living situation in Japan was the result of financial necessity, rather than strategic choice. Most importantly, they felt no guilt about housing me in the garage, because they believed it represented adequate accommodation for someone in my circumstances. Did you get a chance to talk to her about the business investment during the drive? Sandra asked, her voice dropping slightly even though she clearly didn't think I could hear her. Not directly, but I laid some groundwork. I mentioned how expensive everything is getting and how much pressure the business has been under. I think she's definitely thinking about ways she might be able to help. Good. We really need to know where she stands financially before we make any major decisions about the house refinancing. If she can come through with even 20 or 30,000, it would give us so much more flexibility. David and Sandra's conversation confirmed that my visit wasn't primarily about family reunion. It was about financial opportunity. They were viewing my presence as a chance to secure funding for their struggling business, and they were strategizing about how to approach me for money without seeming too desperate or demanding. Just remember, we need to be careful about how we present it, Sandra continued. She's probably proud about her independence, so we want to frame it as an investment opportunity rather than us asking for help. Make it seem like we're doing her a favor by offering good returns on her retirement savings. Exactly. And if we can show her how much the business could grow with some capital injection, she might even want to invest more than we're asking for. I mean, if she's got 40 or 50,000 sitting in some low-interest Japanese bank account, we could probably convince her that helping family is a much better investment. Their assumption that I might have 40 or 50,000 sitting in some low-interest Japanese bank account was fascinating for several reasons. It showed they had significantly increased their estimate of my possible resources since our earlier conversations, but they still had no concept of the actual scale of my wealth. More importantly, they were already planning to manipulate my family loyalty and financial ignorance to extract money from me under the guise of offering investment opportunities. Should we bring it up tonight at dinner? Sandra asked. Let's wait until tomorrow. Give her a chance to settle in and spend some time with the kids. Then we can have a serious conversation about her financial situation and our business opportunity. I want her to feel comfortable and appreciated before we start talking about money. David's strategy of making me feel comfortable and appreciated before discussing money revealed his understanding that their request would require emotional manipulation to succeed. He wanted to establish positive feelings and family bonding before attempting to exploit those feelings for financial gain. As their conversation moved on to other topics, I reflected on how perfectly their attitudes served my purposes for this visit. They were demonstrating exactly the kind of character that justified the lesson I was planning to teach them, while also providing me with evidence of their true motivations and assumptions. I spent the remaining time before dinner setting up my modest belongings in a way that reinforced their perceptions of my limited resources. My simple toiletries arranged neatly in the tiny bathroom, my practical clothes hung carefully in the small closet, my worn laptop placed prominently on the makeshift desk where they would see it and assume it represented the extent of my technology resources. The laptop was actually a strategic prop, functional enough to handle basic email and video calls, but old enough to suggest someone who couldn't afford regular upgrades and didn't have sophisticated technology needs. What David and Sandra couldn't know was that this modest laptop was connected to investment accounts that generated more passive income in a single day than David's business earned in a typical month. At exactly 6 o'clock, I made my way to the back door of the main house, following Sandra's instructions about which entrance to use. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Family members and welcomed guests used the front door, while service providers and less important visitors were directed to the back entrance. The dinner table was set for 5 people, with my place positioned at one end in a way that suggested I was being included in the family meal but wasn't central to the conversation or dynamics. Emma and Jake were excited to have me there, asking questions about my flight, my life in Japan, and what I had brought them from Tokyo. Grandma Maggie, did you bring us any Japanese candy? My friend Sophia said her grandmother brought her amazing candy from Japan when she visited. Emma's enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. I did bring you some special treats from Tokyo, but they're still packed away. I'll give them to you tomorrow when I've had a chance to organize my gifts properly. This was true. I had brought thoughtful presents for the children, though not the elaborate gifts I could easily have afforded. What's it like living in Japan? Is everything really different from here? Jake asked, his curiosity evident despite his usual preteen reserve around adult conversations. Many things are different, But people everywhere want the same basic things: to be happy, to take care of their families, and to feel respected and valued by the people they love. My answer was designed to sound like typical grandmother wisdom while actually delivering a message about the importance of respect that I hoped would resonate with the adults at the table. David and Sandra exchanged glances at my comment about feeling respected and valued, but they seemed to interpret it as general life philosophy rather than a pointed observation about their treatment of me. "It must be hard being so far away from family," Sandra said, with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Don't you get lonely living by yourself in a foreign country?" "Sometimes I miss being close to family, but I've built a wonderful community in Kyoto. My students and their families have become like extended family to me, and my neighbors are incredibly kind and helpful. When you treat people with respect and kindness, you usually receive the same in return." Again, my response contained a subtle message about reciprocal respect, but David and Sandra seemed focused on the implications for my social support system rather than the underlying principle I was articulating. "That's wonderful that you've found community there," David said. "But it must be expensive to maintain connections with people here. All those international phone calls and visits. I bet the flight alone cost a significant portion of your monthly budget." David's comment about flight costs was clearly designed to fish for information about my financial situation while expressing concern about my expenses. He wanted to understand how much discretionary income I had and whether international travel represented a significant financial burden for me. "Travel is expensive, but seeing family is important enough to budget for," I replied. "I've learned to be very careful with money so I can afford the things that matter most to me." My answer reinforced their assumption that I lived on a tight budget while suggesting that I had managed my limited resources well enough to afford occasional travel. This played perfectly into their belief that I might have modest savings that could be available for investment opportunities. "That's so smart, Mom," Sandra chimed in. "Budgeting and planning ahead is so important, especially on a fixed income. You've obviously learned to live very efficiently." Sandra's praise for my efficient living was actually condescending, suggesting that my modest lifestyle was the result of necessity rather than choice. She was positioning my frugality as admirable adaptation to limited circumstances rather than strategic financial management. As dinner continued, the conversation gradually shifted toward topics that revealed more of David and Sandra's assumptions about my situation and their plans for approaching me about money. "Mom, we should probably talk about your travel insurance and health coverage while you're here," David said with apparent concern. "Do you have good medical insurance in Japan? What happens if you need health care while you're visiting the U.S.? David's questions about insurance were reasonable on the surface, but they also served to assess my financial vulnerability and dependence. If I had inadequate insurance coverage, it might indicate financial limitations and could also create leverage for family members who wanted to position themselves as necessary support systems. I have excellent health coverage in Japan, and I purchased comprehensive travel insurance for this trip. Healthcare is actually much more affordable there than it is here, even for foreigners." This was completely true, though David and Sandra interpreted it as confirmation that I had chosen to live in Japan partly for financial reasons. "That's great that you're covered," Sandra said. "We worry about you being so far away if something serious happened. It would be so hard for us to help you or even know if you needed assistance." Sandra's expression of concern contained an implicit suggestion that I was vulnerable and potentially dependent on family support in ways that I might not have considered. She was laying groundwork for positioning their family as my primary safety net and support system. "I appreciate your concern, but I've been very careful to establish support systems and emergency plans. Living independently requires good planning, but it's definitely manageable with the right preparation." My response emphasized my capability and planning skills, while reassuring them that I wasn't a potential burden on their resources. "You've obviously thought it through carefully," David acknowledged, "but you know we're always here if you need anything. Families should take care of each other, especially as we all get older and face new challenges." David's comment about family taking care of each other was interesting because it suggested reciprocal obligation while actually positioning me as the family member most likely to need care and assistance. He was establishing a framework where family support flowed primarily in one direction, toward the older, presumably more vulnerable member. "I completely agree that families should take care of each other," I replied. That's why I work so hard to be self-sufficient and not become a burden on anyone, but it's also why I want to help family members when I can, especially if they're facing challenges or opportunities where my support might make a difference. My response was carefully crafted to reinforce their perception of me as someone who avoided being a burden, while also signaling openness to providing assistance to family members. This played directly into their hopes about my willingness to invest in David's business, while maintaining my image as someone with limited but carefully managed resources. David and Sandra exchanged another glance at my mention of helping family members, and I could see them mentally noting this as confirmation that I might be receptive to their investment proposal. "That's such a generous attitude, Mom," David said. "And speaking of family helping each other, Sandra and I have been dealing with some business challenges that we might want to discuss with you while you're here. Nothing urgent, but you've always been good with financial planning, and we'd value your perspective on some decisions we're trying to make." David's request for my perspective was clearly the opening move in their plan to approach me about investing in his struggling business. He was framing it as seeking advice rather than asking for money, which allowed him to test my receptiveness without seeming desperate or demanding. "I'd be happy to discuss any financial questions you have," I replied. "I may not have professional expertise, but I've learned a few things about managing money over the years." My response demonstrated willingness to engage, while also maintaining the humble, non-threatening persona they expected from their retired English teacher mother. I was positioning myself as someone with practical experience rather than sophisticated knowledge, which would make their eventual shock even more dramatic. "Great! We'll definitely want to sit down and go over everything with you," Sandra said enthusiastically. "David has been working so hard on the business, and we think there might be some interesting opportunities coming up." Quote, Sandra's mention of interesting opportunities was clearly designed to generate curiosity and anticipation about investment possibilities, rather than focusing on the business problems that actually motivated their need for capital. As dinner concluded and we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, the conversation shifted to more general family topics, but I continued to observe details that revealed my family's true attitudes toward my visit and my place in their lives. When Emma wanted to show me her school projects, Sandra quickly intervened with, "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart. Grandma Maggie is probably tired from her long flight and needs to rest soon." This was presented as consideration for my energy levels, but it also served to limit my interaction with the children and establish Sandra's control over family activities and scheduling. When Jake asked if I wanted to see his basketball trophies, David suggested that Grandma probably can't climb all those stairs to your room tonight, buddy. "Why don't you bring a few trophies down here to show her?" Again, this appeared to be accommodation for my age and mobility, but it also reinforced assumptions about my physical limitations and need for special consideration. Most tellingly, when I offered to help clear the dinner dishes, Sandra quickly declined with, "Oh no, Maggie, you're our guest. You should relax while you're here." While this seemed hospitable, it also established that I was a guest rather than a family member, and that my role was to be accommodated rather than to contribute to household functioning. These seemingly small interactions revealed a consistent pattern of treating me as someone whose capabilities were limited, whose needs were secondary to family convenience, and whose presence required management rather than celebration. As the evening wound down and I prepared to return to the garage apartment, David made one final comment that perfectly summarized their expectations for my visit. "Mom, we're so glad you're here, and we want to make sure you have a really restful and enjoyable stay. We know the garage apartment isn't fancy, but we thought you'd appreciate having your own space and not having to deal with all the chaos of the main house. Tomorrow, we can start planning some activities and maybe have that conversation about business stuff when you're feeling more settled." David's statement contained several important elements. First, he was preemptively defending the garage accommodation as being for my benefit rather than their convenience. Second, he was positioning the, quote, business conversation as something that would happen after I was more settled, suggesting that he wanted me to feel comfortable and obligated before discussing money. Most importantly, he was treating my preferences and comfort as secondary considerations that he was graciously accommodating rather than primary concerns that should drive their planning. "Thank you for a lovely evening," I replied. "I'm looking forward to spending time with the family and learning more about what's been happening in everyone's lives." As I made my way back to the garage apartment through the cold December evening, I reflected on how perfectly the first day had established the dynamics I needed to observe. My family had demonstrated their assumptions about my financial limitations, their expectations about my gratitude for minimal accommodation, their plans to approach me for money under the guise of investment opportunities, and their fundamental lack of respect for my autonomy and dignity. The temperature in the garage apartment had dropped significantly during the dinner hours, and the small space heater was struggling to warm the poorly insulated room. As I prepared for bed in the narrow twin bed with its mismatched blankets, I could hear the sounds of family life continuing in the main house. Television programs, conversations, children's laughter, while I remained physically and socially separated from those activities. But rather than feeling sorry for myself, I felt increasingly confident that my family was revealing exactly the kind of character that justified the lesson I had planned to teach them. The black portfolio in my handbag contained documents that would not only shock them with the magnitude of their miscalculations about my resources, but would also demonstrate that their treatment of me had been observed, evaluated, and found completely inadequate. As I settled into the uncomfortable bed in my cold garage accommodation, I thought about the investment portfolios I monitored each morning from my modest apartment in Kyoto, portfolios that generated more passive income in a single week than David's business had earned in the past 6 months. I thought about the respect and admiration I received from my Japanese neighbors, who valued my contributions to their community and treated me as an honored member of their social network rather than a burden to be accommodated. I thought about the sophisticated financial strategies I had developed over 15 years of international investing, strategies that had built wealth at a rate that my family couldn't imagine and wouldn't believe if they were told. But mostly I thought about how dramatically their assumptions about their mother were about to be proven wrong, and how expensive those assumptions were going to become when they realized that the grateful, financially limited elderly woman they were reluctantly hosting was actually someone who could have solved all their problems with a single phone call, if they had ever bothered to treat her with the respect and consideration she deserved. Tomorrow would bring more evidence of their character and more confirmation that the contents of my black portfolio would deliver exactly the kind of education about consequences that they needed to receive. Because the most expensive lessons are often the ones about assuming you know someone's worth based on appearances, and my family was about to discover exactly how much their assumptions were going to cost them. I woke up in the garage apartment at 4:30 a.m. on December 23rd, not because of jet lag, but because that was my normal wake-up time for monitoring Asian markets during their most active trading hours. For 15 years, this had been my daily routine, rising before dawn to spend 3 hours analyzing positions, executing trades, and managing a portfolio that most professional fund managers would envy. The garage apartment was freezing. The space heater had cycled off sometime during the night, and Colorado's December air had thoroughly infiltrated the poorly insulated space. I could see my breath as I quietly moved around the small room, careful not to make noise that might wake my family in the main house. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was shivering in a converted storage shed, while managing investments worth more than most people's entire lifetime earnings. I opened my modest laptop, the same one David and Sandra had noticed yesterday, and assumed represented the extent of my technology resources. What they couldn't know was that this unremarkable machine was connected to trading platforms across 3 continents and gave me real-time access to investments spanning 12 different currencies and 17 major markets. As the laptop powered up, I reflected on how I had built this hidden empire over the past 15 years, transforming Robert's brilliant but relatively modest investment foundation into one of the most successful individual portfolios in Asia. When Robert died in 2009, he left me with approximately $2.3 million in carefully selected international investments, along with detailed notes about his investment philosophy and strategies. For most people, this would have represented a comfortable but unremarkable retirement fund. For me, it became the foundation for something extraordinary. Robert's genius had been his early recognition that American investors consistently undervalued Asian markets because they didn't understand the demographic and technological trends that were reshaping those economies. While most U.S. investors focused on familiar domestic companies, Robert had identified opportunities in Japanese healthcare technology, Korean semiconductors, and emerging Chinese manufacturing sectors that were positioned to benefit from generational shifts in population and consumption patterns. But Robert had been limited by his location, his day job responsibilities, and his natural caution about making dramatic moves with our family's financial security. His investment approach had been methodical and conservative, generating steady returns while minimizing risk exposure. When I moved to Japan 6 months after his death, I had the opportunity to transform his careful foundation into something much more ambitious and profitable. Living in Kyoto gave me several crucial advantages that American investors couldn't replicate. First, I could monitor Asian markets during their most active hours, rather than trying to trade during off-peak periods when liquidity was limited and price movements were less predictable. Second, I could develop relationships with local financial professionals who understood cultural and regulatory nuances that weren't apparent to foreign investors. Most importantly, I could observe demographic and consumer trends firsthand, rather than relying on secondhand analysis and delayed data. My English teaching position provided the perfect cover for these activities. Teaching children 3 days per week gave me a legitimate reason for being in Japan, while leaving me enough time to focus on investment activities. The modest income satisfied any curiosity about how I supported myself, while the predictable schedule meant I was always available during optimal trading hours. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that my apparent status as a modest English teacher actually gave me access to information and opportunities that weren't available to obvious investors. Japanese business culture places enormous emphasis on trust, long-term relationships, and understanding the personal character of potential partners. Wealthy American investors who visited Japan for a few days or weeks were viewed with suspicion and kept at arm's length from the most promising opportunities. But a dedicated English teacher who had committed to living in the community, learning the language, and contributing to local children's education was seen as someone with honorable intentions and genuine cultural respect. Over my first 2 years in Kyoto, I developed relationships with parents of my students who worked in various industries: healthcare, technology, manufacturing, real estate. These weren't formal business relationships, but rather the kind of casual connections that developed naturally when someone was integrated into community life. When Takeshi Yamamoto, whose daughter was one of my most enthusiastic students, mentioned during a parent conference that his company was developing revolutionary cancer treatment protocols that would be commercially available within 5 years, he wasn't giving me investment advice. He was simply sharing his excitement about work he loved with a teacher who had helped his daughter gain confidence in English conversation. When Mrs. Chen, whose son struggled with pronunciation but excelled in reading comprehension, mentioned that her husband's semiconductor firm had developed manufacturing processes that were 3 years ahead of anything their competitors could achieve, she wasn't trying to influence my investment decisions. She was explaining why her family might need to relocate to a larger city as the company expanded. When Mr. Suzuki, whose twin daughters were my most advanced students, described his frustration with the bureaucratic obstacles his biotech startup faced in getting regulatory approval for products that could revolutionize eldercare, he wasn't seeking financial backing. He was venting to someone he trusted about the challenges of innovation in highly regulated industries. But I was listening to all of these conversations with the analytical framework that Robert had taught me, recognizing patterns and opportunities that my role as an English teacher allowed me to observe, but that wouldn't have been shared with someone who appeared to be an investor seeking profitable opportunities. Within 3 years of moving to Japan, I had identified and invested in 11 companies that my casual community connections had helped me understand before they became visible to mainstream investors. When Takeshi's company announced their breakthrough cancer treatment in 2013, my position in their stock generated returns of 340% over 18 months. When Mrs. Chen's husband's semiconductor firm signed exclusive supply contracts with 3 major technology manufacturers, my early investment produced gains of 280% in less than 2 years. But I was careful never to appear to be investing based on inside information or exploiting my relationships with my students' families. Instead, I presented myself as someone who was simply interested in supporting Japanese innovation, and who made small, conservative investments in companies whose work seemed promising for the future. The parents of my students saw my modest investment activities as charming evidence of my commitment to their country and confidence in Japanese business development. They had no idea that my small, conservative investments were actually carefully researched positions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, or that my returns were funding increasingly sophisticated investment strategies across multiple Asian markets. By 2015, 6 years after Robert's death, I had transformed his $2.3 million foundation into a portfolio worth over $8 million. My teaching income covered my modest living expenses, while my investment gains were reinvested in increasingly complex strategies that took advantage of currency fluctuations, demographic trends, and technological developments that most American investors never even heard about. The key to my success wasn't just picking profitable investments. It was understanding how to position myself to learn about opportunities before they became obvious to mainstream financial markets. My reputation as a dedicated English teacher gave me credibility and access within Japanese business communities that would never have been available to someone who appeared to be a professional investor. My modest lifestyle meant that people shared information freely because they weren't worried about me exploiting their trust for significant financial gain. My age and gender meant that I was often dismissed as harmless and non-threatening, which made people more willing to discuss sensitive business matters in my presence. I spent my mornings analyzing markets and executing trades, my afternoons teaching enthusiastic children, and my evenings attending community events, where casual conversations often revealed insights about companies, industries, and economic trends that weren't yet reflected in stock prices or financial analysis. The Japanese concept of nemawashi, building consensus through informal preliminary discussions before formal decision-making, meant that important business developments were often discussed in community settings months before they became public knowledge. My integration into local community life gave me access to these preliminary discussions in ways that formal business relationships never could have provided. By 2018, my portfolio had reached $15 million, and I had developed enough expertise and capital to begin implementing more sophisticated international strategies. I started making investments in Korean technology companies, Hong Kong real estate development firms, and emerging markets across Southeast Asia, where demographic and technological trends created opportunities that American investors consistently overlooked. My success wasn't just due to being in the right place at the right time. It was the result of 15 years of disciplined analysis, strategic relationship building, and careful risk management that had transformed Robert's modest foundation into one of the most successful individual investment portfolios in Asia. But throughout this entire period, my family back in Colorado continued to see me as the English teacher who had made an impractical decision to move to Japan and was probably struggling to make ends meet on teaching income and whatever modest savings she had managed to preserve from Robert's pension and life insurance. David's occasional emails asked about my financial situation in ways that suggested concern about my ability to support myself, never imagining that his mother was actually generating more investment income in a typical month than he earned from his struggling marketing business in an entire year. Sandra's comments about my fixed income and careful budgeting reflected her assumption that I was living on limited resources rather than choosing to live modestly while building extraordinary wealth through sophisticated investment strategies. When they worried about my ability to afford international travel, they never considered that the cost of my flights to Colorado represented less than my portfolio's typical daily gains during active market periods. When they expressed concern about my healthcare and insurance coverage, they didn't realize that I could afford the best medical care available anywhere in the world and had chosen the Japanese system because it provided excellent services at reasonable costs, not because I couldn't afford alternatives. Most importantly, when David started hinting about business investment opportunities and family financial assistance, he had no idea that he was approaching someone who could have solved all of his problems with a simple wire transfer, but who was carefully evaluating whether his character and treatment of family justified that kind of help. Now, sitting in their freezing garage apartment at 5 a.m. on December 23rd, I logged into my trading platforms to review the portfolio that my family couldn't imagine existed. Total portfolio value as of market close in Tokyo, $24.7 million. Yesterday's gains, $847,000, primarily from currency arbitrage positions, and a breakthrough announcement from a biotech company I had invested in 3 years earlier based on a conversation with one of my students' fathers. Passive income generated this month, $312,000 from dividends, bond payments, and real estate distributions. These numbers represented the hidden reality behind the modest English teacher image that had allowed me to build extraordinary wealth while my family assumed I was living on limited retirement savings. As I reviewed my positions and executed several currency trades that would take advantage of overnight developments in European markets, I reflected on how completely David and Sandra had misunderstood both my capabilities and my resources. Tonight, they were planning to approach me about investing in David's struggling business. A business that was failing because David didn't understand the digital marketing trends that were reshaping his industry, didn't have the capital to adapt to those changes, and didn't possess the analytical skills to identify why his clients were choosing competitors instead of his firm. David was hoping to persuade his financially limited mother to invest her modest retirement savings in a business venture that my analysis suggested had less than a 20% chance of long-term success, even with significant capital injection. But more troubling than his poor business judgment was his willingness to exploit what he believed was my financial vulnerability and family loyalty to extract money from me under false pretenses. David wasn't asking for help because he respected my judgment or valued my advice. He was targeting me because he believed I was emotionally and financially vulnerable to manipulation tactics that positioned family assistance as investment opportunity. The conversation I had overheard yesterday evening revealed that he and Sandra had discussed strategies for making me feel comfortable and appreciated before discussing money, ensuring that I would be emotionally invested in their welfare before they presented their financial requests. They were planning to exploit my presumed ignorance about investment opportunities, my apparent gratitude for their hospitality, and my natural desire to help family members in order to extract money from me for a business venture that sophisticated analysis suggested was likely to fail. But what they didn't understand was that their treatment of me over the past 24 hours had already demonstrated exactly the kind of character that disqualified them from receiving any assistance from my actual resources. Housing me in a converted garage while claiming it was for my benefit showed their willingness to prioritize their convenience over my comfort while reframing that selfishness as consideration. Assuming I should be grateful for minimal accommodation rather than ensuring I felt welcomed and valued revealed their view of me as a burden to be managed, rather than a family member to be celebrated. Planning to manipulate my emotions and exploit my presumed financial ignorance demonstrated their willingness to take advantage of what they believed was my vulnerability for their own benefit. Most importantly, their failure to even ask about my actual interests, experiences, or accomplishments during my 15 years in Japan showed their complete lack of curiosity about who I had become or what I had achieved during the most productive and successful period of my life. David and Sandra saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected, and they were about to discover how expensive that perspective could become when applied to someone they had completely underestimated. As I completed my morning trading activities and prepared for another day of observing my family's character, I thought about the black portfolio in my handbag that contained documentation of wealth that exceeded their wildest assumptions about my situation. But more importantly, that portfolio contained evidence of capabilities, accomplishments, and professional relationships that would demonstrate exactly how wrong their assumptions about my limitations had been. Tonight's business discussion would provide them with the perfect opportunity to reveal the full extent of their willingness to exploit their mother for financial gain, while also giving me the ideal setting to teach them a lesson about assumptions and consequences that would change their lives forever. The woman they thought they were manipulating had spent 15 years proving that the most profitable investments were often the ones that seemed impossible to conventional thinking. They were about to discover that underestimating someone can be the most expensive mistake you ever make, especially when that someone has spent decades demonstrating exactly how wrong conventional assumptions can be. As the sun began to rise over the Colorado mountains, casting light through the small window of my inadequate garage accommodation, I looked forward to the moment when my family would realize that their Christmas guest wasn't the financially limited burden they had assumed, but rather someone whose success and capabilities far exceeded anything they had achieved in their own lives. The most satisfying part wouldn't be shocking them with the magnitude of their miscalculation. It would be teaching them that respect and consideration aren't negotiable aspects of family relationships, regardless of someone's apparent circumstances or resources. Because the best investments are sometimes the ones in teaching people lessons they desperately need to learn, even when those lessons are more expensive than they ever imagined they could afford. After completing my morning trading session and securing another $134,000 in gains from overnight Asian market movements, I prepared to spend December 23rd observing how my family would begin their planned campaign to extract money from their financially limited mother. The irony that I had just earned more in 3 hours than David's business generated in 6 months wasn't lost on me as I prepared to play the role of the grateful guest who should feel honored by their minimal hospitality. The main house was quiet when I made my way to the back door at 8 a.m., following yesterday's established protocol about which entrance was appropriate for my status in the household. Through the kitchen window, I could see Sandra preparing breakfast while David sat at the counter with his laptop, presumably working on business matters that I now knew included strategies for approaching me about investment opportunities. "Good morning," Sandra greeted me with forced cheerfulness as I knocked softly on the back door. "How did you sleep? I hope the garage apartment was warm enough. David said the space heater should keep it comfortable out there." Sandra's inquiry about my comfort was perfunctory rather than genuine, and her assumption that the space heater would provide adequate warmth revealed how little thought they had given to my actual accommodation needs. She wasn't really asking whether I had been comfortable. She was confirming that her minimal provisions had been sufficient to avoid any complaints. "I slept fine, thank you. The space heater worked perfectly." This was a diplomatic lie designed to avoid conflict, while demonstrating the gracious, uncomplaining attitude they expected from their houseguest. "Wonderful." I was a little worried that it might get too cold out there, but David assured me that the insulation was good enough. Sandra's response revealed that she had indeed been aware that the garage apartment might be inadequately heated, but had chosen to rely on David's assurances rather than ensuring my comfort herself. David looked up from his laptop with a distracted smile. "Morning, Mom. Sleep well?" "I was just working on some business stuff. You know how it is. Always something that needs attention." David's casual mention of business stuff was clearly intended to plant seeds about his work pressures and professional concerns that would support his later request for investment assistance. He wanted me to see him as a dedicated businessman dealing with legitimate challenges, rather than someone whose poor management had created the problems he was facing. "Of course, sweetheart. Business requires constant attention, especially in challenging economic times." My response acknowledged his efforts while subtly introducing the concept of challenging economic times that would provide context for his later appeals for financial support. "Exactly. It's been a really tough year for small businesses. So many external factors that you can't control, you know?" David was immediately responding to my opening by elaborating on the challenges he faced, positioning his business problems as the result of economic forces, rather than his own strategic failures. "That must be very stressful for you and Sandra," I replied with apparent sympathy. "Running a business during uncertain times requires so much resilience and creativity." "It really does," Sandra chimed in, abandoning her breakfast preparations to join the conversation. "David has been working such long hours trying to keep everything stable. Some months have been really tight, and we've had to make some difficult decisions about expenses and priorities." Sandra's mention of tight months and difficult decisions was clearly designed to introduce the concept of financial pressure without directly asking for help. She was laying groundwork for presenting their situation as temporary hardship that could be resolved with appropriate assistance. "I'm sure you're both doing everything possible to work through the challenges," I said supportively. "These difficult periods often lead to innovations and improvements that make businesses stronger in the long run." "That's such a positive way to look at it, Mom," David said with apparent enthusiasm, "and actually, that's exactly what we've been thinking about. This challenging period has really clarified our vision for where the business could go with the right strategic investments and improvements." David's transition from discussing problems to mentioning, quote, strategic investments was seamless and clearly rehearsed. He was moving from establishing sympathy for his difficulties to introducing the concept of investment opportunities that could solve those problems. "Strategic investments can definitely be transformative," I agreed. "What kind of improvements are you considering?" Quote, "Well, the digital marketing landscape has evolved so much in the past few years," David began, warming to his prepared presentation. "Our clients are demanding more sophisticated analytics, social media integration, and real-time campaign optimization. We need to upgrade our technology platforms and possibly hire specialists who understand these newer approaches. David's description of needed improvements was accurate, though it revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of why his business was failing. He was focusing on technological solutions rather than addressing the strategic and creative deficiencies that had caused his clients to choose competitors in the first place. That sounds like a significant undertaking, I observed. Technology upgrades and specialist hiring must require substantial capital investment. Exactly, Sandra exclaimed, as if I had identified the crucial challenge they were facing. David has researched everything thoroughly, and he's developed a really comprehensive plan for modernizing the business. The only challenge is funding the initial improvements. Sandra's enthusiasm about David's comprehensive plan was touching, though my analysis of his business documentation suggested that his planning was superficial and his understanding of digital marketing trends was several years behind current best practices. How much capital would these improvements require? I asked, playing the role of the interested family member who wanted to understand their situation. David and Sandra exchanged glances, the kind of quick eye contact that suggested they had rehearsed this moment and were pleased that the conversation was proceeding according to their plan. Well, to do everything properly, we'd probably need around $80,000, David said carefully. That would cover the technology upgrades, some additional staff, and enough working capital to implement new client acquisition strategies. The figure of $80,000 was significantly higher than the $40,000 David had mentioned during our phone conversation 6 months earlier, suggesting that either his needs had increased or his assessment of my potential resources had grown more optimistic. That is a significant investment, I replied thoughtfully. Have you explored traditional business financing options? We've looked into everything, Sandra said quickly. Bank loans require personal guarantees that would put our house at risk, and the interest rates are really high right now. Small business lenders want collateral that we don't have available. What about bringing in business partners or outside investors? I asked, continuing to probe their reasoning for approaching family rather than pursuing commercial funding. We considered that, David replied, but giving up equity means losing control of business decisions. And most outside investors don't really understand our industry or our long-term vision. They just want quick returns rather than supporting sustainable growth. David's explanation for avoiding outside investors revealed his unwillingness to submit his business plan to professional scrutiny, which would likely expose the strategic weaknesses that made his company uncompetitive. He preferred to approach family members who might be influenced by emotional considerations rather than rigorous financial analysis. I can understand wanting to maintain control of your business vision, I said diplomatically. Family involvement certainly offers different advantages than commercial financing. Exactly, David said with obvious relief that I seemed to understand his perspective. Family members care about long-term success rather than just financial returns. And working with family means supporting each other through challenges rather than just extracting profits. David's contrast between family support and profit extraction was ironic, given that he was attempting to extract money from me based on false assumptions about my resources and motivations. He was presenting family investment as altruistic collaboration, while actually planning to exploit what he believed was my emotional vulnerability and financial ignorance. Family businesses can definitely be successful when everyone shares common goals and values, I agreed. What kind of return would you expect to provide on family investment? This question was designed to test whether David was offering legitimate investment opportunities or simply seeking loans disguised as business partnerships. Well, we'd want to be fair and generous with family investors, Sandra said quickly. We were thinking about offering 8% annual returns, which is much better than what you'd get from savings accounts or CDs. Quote, Sandra's offer of 8% returns was presented as generous, but it was actually below the risk-adjusted returns that should be expected from investing in struggling small businesses. More importantly, her comparison to savings accounts revealed her assumption that my alternative investments were limited to conservative, low-yield options. And of course, there would be the satisfaction of knowing that your investment was helping families succeed and grow, David added. That's worth something beyond just financial returns. David's appeal to family loyalty was the emotional manipulation component of their strategy. He was suggesting that I should be willing to accept below-market returns because of the intangible benefits of supporting family members, never considering that his treatment of me might have compromised my willingness to prioritize his welfare over sound investment principles. Family satisfaction is certainly valuable, I acknowledged, but I'd want to understand the business fundamentals before making any investment decisions. Could you share your financial statements and business projections? David and Sandra exchanged another glance, this one less confident than the previous ones. They clearly hadn't expected me to request detailed financial documentation, assuming instead that family investment decisions would be based on trust and emotional appeal rather than rigorous analysis. Of course, we can put together some financial information for you, David said with less enthusiasm than he had shown earlier. I should mention that the past year's numbers don't really reflect the business's potential because of all the external challenges we've been facing. David's preemptive disclaimer about his financial performance was a red flag that suggested his business results were worse than he had initially indicated. He was already making excuses for poor numbers before sharing any specific data. I understand that recent performance might not reflect future potential, I replied, but historical financial data would help me understand the business fundamentals and cash flow patterns. Absolutely, Sandra said quickly. David has all of that information organized. We just want to make sure we present everything in a way that gives you the complete picture, rather than just focusing on one challenging year. Quote. Sandra's concern about presenting the quote, picture suggested that their recent financial performance was particularly poor and would require significant context and explanation to appear acceptable to potential investors. As breakfast continued, David and Sandra gradually revealed more details about their business situation that confirmed my earlier analysis of their fundamental problems. Their client base had declined by 40% over the past 2 years, with their largest clients citing dissatisfaction with campaign results and lack of innovative strategies. Their revenue had dropped correspondingly, while their fixed costs remained high because David had been reluctant to reduce staff or office expenses in ways that might signal business distress to remaining clients. They had been covering operating shortfalls by accumulating credit card debt and deferring payments to suppliers, creating a cash flow crisis that threatened to become unsustainable within the next 6 months. Most tellingly, David's analysis of why clients were leaving focused on external factors: economic uncertainty, industry consolidation, unfair competition from larger agencies, rather than acknowledging the strategic and creative deficiencies that had made his services less valuable than alternatives available from competitors. The biggest challenge is that larger agencies can afford to offer services at below market rates because they have economies of scale, David explained. Small businesses like ours can't compete on price alone. We need to offer superior service and more personalized attention. David's explanation revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of why his business was losing clients. He was focusing on pricing competition, rather than acknowledging that his services were no longer meeting client needs effectively, regardless of cost considerations. What do your client feedback and satisfaction surveys indicate about their reasons for choosing other providers? I asked, testing whether David had gathered systematic data about his competitive disadvantages. Well, we don't really do formal surveys, David admitted. Most of our client feedback comes through informal conversations and account management discussions. David's lack of systematic client feedback mechanisms revealed his poor business management practices and his reluctance to gather data that might challenge his assumptions about why his company was failing. But the feedback we do get is generally positive, Sandra added quickly. Clients appreciate David's creativity and personal attention. The challenges are usually about budget constraints and external pressures rather than service quality. Sandra's characterization of client feedback as generally positive was contradicted by the fact that 40% of their clients had terminated their relationships with David's company over the past 2 years. She was either misunderstanding the feedback they received or choosing to interpret neutral or negative comments in the most favorable possible way. As the morning progressed and we moved from breakfast to coffee in the living room, David and Sandra continued developing their case for why family investment represented an attractive opportunity for me personally. Mom, one of the things we really like about the idea of family investment is that it would give you an opportunity to be more involved in our lives and see your money working to support something meaningful, David said with apparent sincerity. Rather than having your retirement savings sitting in some impersonal bank account in Japan, You could be part of building something that benefits the whole family, Sandra added. Emma and Jake would love knowing that their grandmother was helping secure their parents' business and their family's future. Their appeal to my desire for family involvement was emotionally manipulative in several ways. First, it assumed that my current investments were impersonal and unsatisfying rather than sophisticated and rewarding. Second, it suggested that my financial choices should be motivated by my grandchildren's emotional satisfaction rather than sound investment principles. Most importantly, it implied that supporting their business was equivalent to supporting the family's welfare, ignoring the possibility that poor business decisions might actually harm family financial security. I certainly want to support the family's long-term success and security, I replied carefully. That's why I'd want to be confident that any investment would actually achieve those goals, rather than creating additional financial pressure. David's expression showed a flicker of concern at my mention of additional financial pressure, suggesting that he hadn't fully considered the possibility that his business problems might worsen, despite capital injection. Well, obviously any business involves some risk, David acknowledged reluctantly. But we've been operating successfully for 8 years, and we understand our market and our clients. With adequate capital to make necessary improvements, we're confident about achieving sustainable growth. David's claim of operating successfully for 8 years was technically true but misleading, since his recent performance indicated that previous success hadn't translated into sustainable competitive advantages. His confidence about achieving growth with capital injection ignored the strategic problems that had caused his recent decline. I appreciate your confidence, I said diplomatically, and I'm certainly interested in learning more about the opportunity. Could you put together a comprehensive presentation that includes financial statements, market analysis, and detailed projections for how the investment would be used? David and Sandra's enthusiasm diminished noticeably at my request for comprehensive documentation. They had clearly hoped that family investment would be based on trust and emotional appeal, rather than the kind of rigorous analysis that commercial investors would require. Absolutely, we can prepare that information, David said with less conviction than he had shown earlier. How detailed would you want the projections to be? Detailed enough for me to understand the assumptions behind your growth expectations and the risks that might affect those projections, I replied. I'd want to see monthly cash flow forecasts, sensitivity analysis for different scenarios, and comparison with industry benchmarks. The level of analysis I was requesting was appropriate for any significant investment decision, but David and Sandra's expressions suggested that they hadn't prepared such detailed planning and weren't confident about their ability to justify their projections under rigorous scrutiny. That's very thorough, Sandra said carefully. We want to make sure we present everything professionally, so it might take us a few days to put together that level of documentation. Sandra's concern about presenting information professionally revealed that their previous business planning had been informal and unsystematic. They were realizing that family investment would require more rigorous preparation than they had anticipated. Take whatever time you need, I assured them. Important decisions deserve careful consideration and complete information. As our conversation concluded and David and Sandra began discussing their plans for preparing investment documentation, I reflected on how perfectly their approach confirmed my analysis of their character and motivations. They had assumed that family investment would be based on emotional manipulation rather than financial merit. They had attempted to exploit what they believed was my gratitude for their hospitality and my desire to support family welfare. They had presented their business problems as external challenges, rather than acknowledging their own strategic failures. Most importantly, they had never asked about my actual investment experience, financial goals, or comfort with business risk, because they assumed I was financially unsophisticated and would make decisions based on trust and family loyalty rather than analytical evaluation. David and Sandra had spent the morning revealing exactly the kind of character that disqualified them from receiving any assistance from my actual resources, while also demonstrating that their business problems were more severe and their solutions less viable than they were willing to acknowledge. Tonight would bring the formal presentation of their investment proposal, giving me the perfect opportunity to observe their willingness to exploit what they believed was my financial vulnerability for their own benefit. But they had no idea that their financially limited mother had spent the morning managing investments worth more than their house, their business, and their lifetime earnings combined, or that their treatment of me was being evaluated against standards they couldn't imagine. The woman they thought they were manipulating was actually someone who could solve all of their problems with a single phone call, but who was instead documenting evidence that they didn't deserve that kind of assistance. Because the most expensive lessons are often the ones about assuming you understand someone's capabilities based on appearances. And my family was about to receive an education that would cost them everything they thought they were entitled to inherit. December 23rd evening arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado winter air that made the garage apartment's heating inadequacies even more apparent. As I prepared for what David and Sandra believed would be their successful pitch to extract investment funds from their financially limited mother, I reflected on how perfectly the past 2 days had revealed their true character and motivations. At 7 p.m., David knocked on the garage apartment door with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he had spent the afternoon rehearsing his presentation and psyching himself up for what he hoped would be a profitable conversation. "Mom, would you like to come inside? Sandra made some coffee, and we thought this might be a good time to discuss that business opportunity we mentioned." David's invitation was delivered with forced casualness, as if the conversation was happening spontaneously rather than being the carefully planned centerpiece of my entire visit. His reference to business opportunity, rather than investment request, revealed his strategy of framing their financial needs as benefits he was offering me. "Of course, sweetheart. I'd love to learn more about your plans." I gathered my black portfolio and followed David into the main house, noting that once again I was directed to use the back door, despite being invited for an important family discussion. The living room had been arranged for what was clearly intended to be a formal presentation. David's laptop was connected to a large monitor, several printed documents were arranged on the coffee table, and Sandra had prepared coffee service with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she understood the importance of this conversation for their family's financial future. Emma and Jake were conspicuously absent, having been sent to friends' houses for sleepovers that would ensure adult privacy for discussions about money. This was actually perfect for my purposes, as it meant the children wouldn't witness what was about to unfold. "Mom, we really appreciate you taking the time to consider this opportunity," Sandra began, as we settled into the living room. "David has put together a comprehensive presentation that we think demonstrates why this could be a great investment for everyone involved." Sandra's emphasis on the word investment reinforced their strategy of presenting their financial problems as opportunities I should feel grateful to access. She was positioning herself as someone doing me a favor by allowing me to participate in their business, rather than acknowledging that they were asking for help with serious financial difficulties. David powered up his laptop and began what was clearly a rehearsed presentation, complete with slides that had obviously been hastily prepared that afternoon. "Mom, I want to start by giving you some background about the digital marketing industry and why now is such an exciting time for companies that are positioned to take advantage of emerging trends." David's opening focused on industry opportunities rather than his company's specific situation, which was a smart strategy for avoiding immediate discussion of his business failures. He was trying to generate enthusiasm about market potential before revealing the challenges that made capital investment necessary. For the next 20 minutes, David presented slides about digital marketing growth rates, emerging technologies, and case studies of successful agency transformations that had resulted from strategic investments. His presentation was professionally formatted and contained legitimate industry data, though none of it addressed why his specific company was losing clients, or how additional capital would solve his competitive disadvantages. "As you can see, the companies that are succeeding in this environment are the ones that are willing to invest in new technologies and specialized expertise," David concluded. "That's exactly the opportunity we're facing right now." David's conclusion cleverly positioned his need for capital as evidence that he understood industry trends and was prepared to make the strategic investments necessary for success. He was framing his financial problems as market positioning rather than business failure. "The presentation is very impressive, David," I said diplomatically. "You've clearly done substantial research about industry trends. How does your company's current situation fit into these broader patterns?" David's expression showed a brief flicker of discomfort at my question about his company's current situation, but he quickly recovered and launched into the portion of his presentation that addressed his business specifically. Well, that's where things get really interesting, David said with manufactured enthusiasm. Our company has exactly the kind of client relationships and industry expertise that position us to benefit from these trends. But we need to make some strategic investments to fully capitalize on the opportunities. David was continuing his strategy of presenting business problems as positioning advantages, suggesting that his company's situation was enviable rather than precarious. The next series of slides showed financial projections that painted an optimistic picture of revenue growth and profitability improvements that would result from the $80,000 investment he was requesting. According to David's projections, this capital injection would generate a 300% return over 3 years, while providing 8% annual distributions to investors. What David's presentation didn't include was any honest analysis of why his company had lost 40% of its clients, why his services were no longer competitive in the marketplace, or why his understanding of digital marketing trends was several years behind current best practices. These projections look very optimistic, I observed. What assumptions are they based on, and how confident are you about achieving these results? David and Sandra exchanged glances that suggested they had hoped I would focus on the projected returns, rather than questioning the underlying assumptions. While the projections are based on our historical performance during strong periods, adjusted for the improvements we'll be able to make with additional capital, David explained carefully. Obviously, any business projections involve some uncertainty, but we're confident about the fundamental assumptions. David's explanation revealed that his projections were based on past performance, rather than realistic assessment of current market conditions or his company's competitive position. He was essentially arguing that additional capital would restore historical success without addressing why that success had deteriorated. I'd like to understand the risks that might prevent you from achieving these projections, I said. What are the main challenges that could affect your business performance? This question was designed to test whether David would acknowledge the serious problems his company faced or continue to minimize risks in order to make his investment proposal more attractive. The main risks are really external factors that affect the whole industry, Sandra answered quickly. Economic uncertainty, changes in digital platform policies, increased competition from larger agencies. But those are challenges that every company in the industry faces. Sandra's focus on external risks while ignoring internal problems confirmed that they either didn't understand why their business was failing or weren't willing to acknowledge those problems in front of potential investors. What about company-specific risks like client retention, service quality, or competitive positioning? I pressed. How do those factors affect your projections? David's discomfort was becoming more obvious as my questions focused on areas where his company's performance was weakest. Client retention has been challenging recently, but that's primarily due to external economic pressures rather than service issues, David said defensively. Once we're able to upgrade our technology and expand our service offerings, we expect client relationships to stabilize and improve. David's explanation was internally contradictory. If client departures were due to external economic pressures, technology upgrades wouldn't address the underlying problems. He was grasping for explanations that avoided acknowledging his company's fundamental lack of competitiveness. I see, I said thoughtfully. And how much of the $80,000 investment would be used for technology upgrades versus working capital and other expenses? This question was designed to understand whether David's capital needs were primarily for business improvements or for covering operating shortfalls and existing debts. We've allocated about $45,000 for technology and staff improvements and $35,000 for working capital and market expansion initiatives, David replied, with the precision of someone who had anticipated this question. David's allocation suggested that nearly half of the requested investment would go toward covering cash flow problems, rather than making the strategic improvements he had emphasized in his presentation. This was essentially asking me to subsidize existing losses while hoping that remaining funds would generate enough improvement to justify the investment. That seems like a substantial portion for working capital, I observed. Is the company currently profitable? Or would the investment be needed to cover operating losses while improvements are implemented? Quote. David and Sandra's expressions showed that they had reached the point in the conversation where continuing to minimize their problems would be obviously dishonest, but acknowledging the full extent of their difficulties might undermine their investment request. The past 6 months have been challenging from a cash flow perspective, David admitted reluctantly. We've had some timing issues with client payments and higher than expected technology costs. The working capital portion of the investment would help stabilize operations while we implement improvements. David's description of timing issues and higher than expected costs was a euphemistic way of acknowledging that his company was losing money and accumulating debt. He was finally admitting that they needed investment capital to avoid business failure rather than to capitalize on growth opportunities. I appreciate your honesty about the cash flow challenges, I said. What happens if the investment doesn't generate the improvements you're projecting? What's your contingency plan for protecting investor capital? This question was designed to test whether David had realistic backup plans or was simply hoping that additional capital would solve problems he didn't fully understand. Well, in a worst-case scenario, we could liquidate the business assets and return a significant portion of the investment, David said with obvious reluctance to discuss failure scenarios. But we're really confident that won't be necessary, given our understanding of the market and our client relationships. David's contingency plan was essentially admitting that business liquidation might result in partial loss of invested capital, while his confidence about avoiding that scenario was based on the same optimistic assumptions that had failed to prevent his current problems. As David concluded his formal presentation and Sandra began serving coffee, I realized that I had gathered all the evidence I needed about their character, their business judgment, and their willingness to exploit what they believed was my financial vulnerability. They had presented their struggling business as an attractive investment opportunity. They had minimized serious risks while exaggerating potential returns. They had attempted to manipulate my family loyalty and assumed financial ignorance to extract money for a venture that sophisticated analysis suggested was likely to fail. Most importantly, they had spent 2 days treating me as a burden to be accommodated rather than a person to be respected, while simultaneously planning to exploit my presumed gratitude and financial limitations for their own benefit. It was time for them to learn exactly how wrong their assumptions had been. David, Sandra, I appreciate the time and effort you've put into this presentation, I began carefully. Before I respond to your investment proposal, I have some information to share with you that might affect how we proceed. I reached for the black portfolio I had carried into the living room and placed it on the coffee table between us. What kind of information, Mom? David asked, his tone suggesting curiosity mixed with concern that I might have questions or objections that could complicate their request. Information about my actual financial situation and investment experience, I replied, opening the portfolio to reveal the documents I had prepared for this moment. I spread the first document across the coffee table, a portfolio summary from my investment management firm showing total assets of $24.7 million as of yesterday's market close. The silence that followed was profound and complete. David stared at the document for nearly a full minute before looking up at me with an expression of total bewilderment. Mom, what is this? This is a summary of my investment portfolio, David, my actual investment portfolio, which I've been building and managing successfully for the past 15 years. That can't be real, Sandra whispered, her voice barely audible. $24 million? That's not possible. Actually, Sandra, it's not only possible, it's the result of 15 years of careful investing, sophisticated financial analysis, and strategic positioning in Asian markets that most American investors overlook. I spread out additional documents, trading records showing yesterday's $134,000 gains, monthly income statements showing passive income that exceeded David's annual business revenue, and investment analysis reports that demonstrated the kind of financial expertise they had never imagined I possessed. Mom, I don't understand, David said, his voice shaking. If you have this much money, why are you living in a small apartment in Japan? Why do you live so modestly? Why didn't you tell us? David, I live modestly because I choose to live modestly, not because I can't afford alternatives. I live in Japan because it positions me optimally for Asian market investing, not because I'm struggling financially. And I didn't tell you because I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I needed your help, rather than when you knew I could solve all your problems. But the garage apartment, the space heater, everything. Sandra was struggling to reconcile their treatment of me with the evidence of my actual resources. Sandra, you put me in the garage apartment because you assumed I should be grateful for minimal accommodation. You never asked what I might prefer or need, because you decided that my comfort was secondary to your convenience. I pulled out another document, a detailed analysis of David's business that I had prepared using professional investment evaluation methods. David, I've thoroughly analyzed your business proposal using the same methods I apply to all potential investments. Your company has fundamental strategic problems that additional capital won't solve. Your client retention issues are due to service quality and competitive positioning, not external economic factors. Your projected returns are unrealistic given current market conditions and your company's track record. David was reading the business analysis with growing horror as he realized that his mother had not only seen through his optimistic projections, but had identified problems he had never acknowledged himself. More importantly, I continued, your approach to requesting this investment reveals character problems that disqualify you from receiving any assistance from my actual resources. What do you mean, character problems? Sandra asked defensively. Sandra, you spent 2 days treating me like a burden while planning to exploit what you believed was my financial vulnerability. You attempted to manipulate my family loyalty and presumed ignorance to extract money for a business venture you knew had serious problems. I spread out the final document, a new will I had prepared that completely excluded David from my estate. This is my updated will, prepared last week after months of observing how you treat family members you believe are financially dependent on you. David, because of your attempts to manipulate and exploit your mother, you have been completely excluded from my estate. The effect was immediate and devastating. David's face went white as he realized that his manipulation attempts had cost him an inheritance worth tens of millions of dollars. Mom, you can't be serious, David whispered. David, I'm completely serious. The son, who tried to exploit his mother's presumed financial limitations, will inherit exactly what he deserves from those manipulation attempts. Nothing. But what about Emma and Jake? Sandra asked desperately. Emma and Jake will be provided for through trusts that you cannot access or control. They'll receive excellent educations and financial security, but those benefits will come with conditions that ensure they learn to treat elderly people with respect, rather than viewing them as opportunities for exploitation. Mom, I made mistakes, but I was trying to help the family, David pleaded. I thought I was making good business decisions. David, you weren't trying to help the family. You were trying to exploit what you believed was my vulnerability for your own benefit. You never asked about my actual needs, interests, or capabilities because you assumed I was too limited to have meaningful input. Can't we work something out? Can't I make this right somehow? David was becoming desperate as he realized the magnitude of his losses. David, you can't undo the past 2 days of demonstrating how you treat family members when you think they're vulnerable and dependent. You revealed your true character when you thought I couldn't defend myself. And that character doesn't deserve to benefit from wealth you tried to steal through manipulation. Sandra was crying now, probably realizing that David's manipulation attempts had cost their family financial security beyond anything they had ever imagined possible. Maggie, isn't there anything we can do, some way to prove that we've learned from this? Sandra, learning means understanding why behavior was wrong, not just regretting the consequences. You participated in attempting to exploit an elderly family member because you thought she was powerless to resist. That behavior reveals fundamental character flaws that can't be fixed with apologies. I stood up and began gathering my documents, preparing to return to the garage apartment one final time before leaving their house forever. Where are you going? David asked desperately. I'm going to my hotel. I've booked a suite at the Four Seasons for the remainder of my visit, where I'll spend Christmas being treated with the respect and consideration that every person deserves. What about Emma and Jake? They'll be devastated if you leave. Emma and Jake will visit me at my hotel tomorrow, where I'll explain that families should be based on love and respect rather than manipulation and exploitation. They'll learn that treating people well because of who they are is more important than treating them well because of what they might give you. As I walked toward the door, David made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Mom, please don't leave like this. We can talk about everything, work out our problems, start over with better understanding. I turned to face my son one last time. David, Some lessons are too important to soften with second chances. You spent 15 years assuming your mother was becoming irrelevant to your life, except as a potential source of emergency funding. You treated me like a burden while planning to exploit what you believed was my financial desperation. Those choices have consequences that you'll live with for the rest of your life. But I love you, Mom. David, love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't exploit vulnerability. Love doesn't treat people as opportunities rather than human beings. What you showed me wasn't love. It was entitlement and greed disguised as family concern. As I walked out of David's house for the last time, carrying my black portfolio and my single modest suitcase, I reflected on the perfect justice of how everything had unfolded. David and Sandra had gotten exactly what they had given. They had treated me as someone whose comfort and dignity didn't matter, and they had lost access to wealth that could have solved all their problems if they had simply treated me with basic respect and consideration. The garage apartment they had thought was adequate accommodation for their financially limited mother would serve as a permanent reminder that assumptions about people's worth can be the most expensive mistakes you ever make. 3 months later, I received a letter from David that confirmed he had finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. Mom, he wrote, I've spent every day since Christmas thinking about how wrong I was about everything. Not just about your financial situation, but about what kind of person you are and what kind of person I was being. I realize now that losing the inheritance was the least of what I deserved. I lost my relationship with the most remarkable woman I've ever known because I was too selfish and greedy to see who you really were. David went on to explain that his business had failed within 2 months of my visit, that Sandra had filed for divorce, and that he was working at rebuilding his life while trying to become someone worthy of his children's respect. I know I can never undo what I did or earn back your trust, he concluded. But I want you to know that your lesson about consequences has changed how I think about family, respect, and the kind of person I want to be. I hope someday I can prove that I learned something valuable from the most expensive mistake I'll ever make. I never responded to David's letter, but I did increase the funding for Emma and Jake's trust funds and established a scholarship program for students studying ethics and family relationships. Because sometimes the most important investments are the ones that teach people lessons they desperately need to learn, even when those lessons cost more than they ever imagined they could afford. The woman David thought he was exploiting had taught him that underestimating someone can be the most expensive education you ever receive, especially when that someone has spent 70 years proving exactly how wrong assumptions about limitations can be. And the simple black portfolio I had left on his coffee table that December evening would serve as a permanent reminder that respect isn't negotiable, dignity isn't optional, and treating people well isn't conditional on what they might be able to give you in return. Author's note, asterisk, asterisk. This story is dedicated to every person who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or taken for granted because others made assumptions about their worth based on appearance, age, or circumstances. Remember that respect should be given freely, not earned through demonstrations of power or wealth. If you or someone you know is experiencing family financial manipulation or elder abuse, resources are available through local adult protective services, elder law attorneys, and financial advocacy organizations. The most valuable lesson isn't about hidden wealth. It's about treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of what you think they can or cannot do for you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.